Get this waitress out of my sight. She's incompetent, and I don't want her working in any restaurant I own ever again." Those were the words billionaire Ethan Caldwell shouted across a crowded dining room, completely unaware that the young woman standing frozen beside the table was his own daughter. The evening had begun like any other Thursday at the Grand Meridian, one of the most exclusive restaurants in downtown Chicago. Crystal chandeliers cast warm golden light across polished marble floors. Soft jazz drifted through the air. Wealthy guests laughed over expensive meals, while servers moved carefully between tables carrying plates that cost more than some people spent on groceries in a week. Ethan Caldwell sat near the center of the room. At 61 years old, he was one of the most powerful real estate developers in the country. His silver hair was perfectly styled. His tailored navy suit probably cost more than most monthly rent payments. People noticed when he entered a room. They always did. Across the restaurant, 24-year-old Lily Harper balanced a tray against her shoulder as she hurried between tables. She had been working a double shift since early that morning. Her feet ached. Her back hurt. But she kept smiling because she needed every hour she could get. Rent was due in 3 days. Her mother's medical bills were waiting on the kitchen counter at home, and losing this job was simply not an option. Lily approached Ethan's table carrying a fresh cup of coffee. At that exact moment, another server accidentally brushed past her shoulder. The movement was small, barely noticeable, but it was enough. A few drops of coffee splashed onto the white tablecloth beside Ethan's hand. Silence fell instantly. Lily's heart dropped. "I'm so sorry, sir," she said quickly. "I'll replace everything immediately." Ethan stared at the small stain as if it were a personal insult. His expression hardened. "Do you have any idea who I am?" he asked coldly. Lily swallowed. "Yes, sir. I apologize." "Then maybe you should learn how to do your job properly." Nearby conversations began to fade as guests listened. The restaurant manager rushed over. "Mr. Caldwell, I'm sure we can fix it." Ethan interrupted. His voice grew louder. "People like this don't belong in establishments like this." Lily felt dozens of eyes turning toward her. Heat rushed into her face. She wanted to disappear. "Sir, it was an accident," she said softly. Ethan stood from his chair. "An accident caused by incompetence. I want her fired. Tonight." The manager looked trapped. Nobody wanted to challenge Ethan Caldwell. He owned buildings across the city. He knew investors, politicians, executives. One complaint from him could damage a business overnight. Lily lowered her eyes. She had learned long ago that arguing with powerful people rarely changed anything. "I'm sorry," she whispered again. Ethan shook his head in disgust. Then, for just a moment, something caught his attention. Hanging around Lily's neck was a small silver necklace. The pendant glimmered beneath the restaurant lights. Ethan froze. His stomach tightened unexpectedly. He knew that necklace, or at least one exactly like it. 25 years earlier, he had given the same pendant to a woman he once loved. A woman who had disappeared from his life without explanation. For a brief second, old memories flashed through his mind. Summer sunlight. A lake in Wisconsin. A smile he had never completely forgotten. Then the moment passed. Ethan looked away. The manager quietly asked Lily to step into the office. She nodded and walked toward the back of the restaurant. She never cried. Not there. Not in front of strangers. But as she disappeared through the swinging kitchen doors, her fingers instinctively reached for the silver necklace resting against her chest. The necklace her mother had told her never to take off. And for the first time all evening, Ethan Caldwell found himself unable to stop thinking about it. The manager's office was barely larger than a storage closet. A single fluorescent light buzzed overhead, casting a pale glow across stacks of paperwork and supply boxes. Lily sat quietly in the chair across from the desk, her hands folded in her lap. She had expected this conversation the moment Ethan Caldwell raised his voice in the dining room. The manager, Robert Jenkins, looked exhausted. He was a decent man in his 50s who had spent 20 years working in restaurants. Tonight, he could not even meet her eyes. "Lily," he said softly, "you know how much we value your work here." She gave a small smile. "Which means I am being let go." Robert sighed heavily. "I am afraid so." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Outside the office door, dishes clinked and muted conversations drifted through the hallway. Life continued as though nothing had happened. "I understand," Lily finally said. Robert looked surprised. "You are not going to argue?" Lily shook her head. "Would it change anything?" The answer sat between them. They both knew it would not. 20 minutes later, Lily stepped out into the cool Chicago night, carrying a cardboard box filled with her belongings. The city lights reflected off rain-soaked sidewalks. Traffic moved steadily through the streets. People hurried past without noticing the young woman standing alone beneath the glow of a street lamp. Lily pulled her jacket tighter against the evening breeze and began the walk toward the train station. Her phone buzzed. A message from her mother. "Are you finished with work, sweetheart?" Lily stared at the screen for a second before typing back. "Almost home. Do not wait up." The train ride took 40 minutes. By the time she reached her neighborhood, most of the expensive skyscrapers were far behind her. The buildings here were older, smaller, more worn by time. She climbed 3 flights of stairs and unlocked the door to a modest apartment. The smell of chicken soup greeted her immediately. Margaret Harper sat wrapped in a blanket on the couch. At 58, she still carried traces of the beauty she must have had in her younger years. Her blonde hair had faded to silver at the edges. Her eyes remained warm despite years of hardship. "You are late," Margaret said gently. Lily forced a smile. "Busy night. But mothers always notice." Margaret studied her daughter's face. "What happened?" Lily set down the box. Silence answered first. Then she finally said, "I lost my job." Concern flashed across Margaret's face. "Oh, Lily." "It is fine," Lily replied quickly. "I will find another one." But her voice lacked conviction. Medical bills sat on the kitchen counter. Rent was due in 3 days. Their savings account had been shrinking for months. Margaret reached for her daughter's hand. "I am sorry." Lily squeezed her fingers and nodded. She did not want pity. She was too tired for tears. Later that night, after Margaret had gone to bed, Lily sat alone at the small kitchen table. Moonlight filtered through the window. The apartment was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. Her eyes drifted toward an old wooden box sitting on a shelf nearby. Inside were photographs, letters, and memories from a life before she was born. One picture had always fascinated her. It showed her mother standing beside a young man near a lake. They were smiling at each other as though the rest of the world did not exist. The man's face was partially faded from age, but something about him always seemed familiar. Lily opened the box and looked at the photograph again. Then her fingers touched the silver necklace resting against her collarbone. "Who were you?" she whispered to the stranger in the picture. Across the city, in a penthouse overlooking Chicago's skyline, Ethan Caldwell stood alone beside floor-to-ceiling windows. He should have been reviewing business reports. Instead, his mind kept returning to a silver necklace he had not seen in more than 2 decades. And for the first time in many years, sleep refused to come. The next morning arrived gray and quiet. Low clouds hung over Chicago, turning the skyline into a blur of steel and glass. Ethan Caldwell stood in his penthouse kitchen, holding a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. He had barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the silver necklace. Every time he tried to dismiss it as coincidence, another memory surfaced. By 8 o'clock, he was seated inside his private office overlooking the city. Usually, his mornings were filled with meetings, contracts, and phone calls worth millions of dollars. Today, none of it held his attention. His longtime attorney and friend, Daniel Brooks, entered carrying a folder. "You wanted to see me?" Ethan nodded. "I need information." "About someone." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "That sounds unusually personal." Ethan hesitated. "A young woman named Lily Harper." Daniel sat down slowly. "What exactly are you looking for?" Ethan stared toward the window. "Everything." An hour later, Daniel left with instructions that made little sense to him. Ethan himself struggled to explain why he felt compelled to investigate a waitress he had met for less than 10 minutes. Yet the feeling would not leave him. Across town, Lily spent the morning searching online job listings. The small kitchen table had become her temporary office. A notebook sat beside her laptop, filled with restaurant names and application deadlines. Every few minutes, she glanced toward the hallway where her mother rested. Medical appointments, prescription costs, utility bills. The numbers never seemed to stop growing. Around noon, Margaret emerged from her bedroom carrying a worn cardboard box. "I found something while cleaning," she said softly. Lily looked up. "What is it?" Margaret set the box on the table. Inside were old photographs, newspaper clippings, and several unopened letters yellowed with age. Lily immediately recognized many of them. They had followed her through every apartment they had ever lived in. You still keep all this?" Lily asked. Margaret smiled faintly. "Some memories are difficult to throw away." Lily picked up one of the photographs. The same young couple stood beside a lake beneath bright summer sunlight. This time she studied the man's face more carefully. The resemblance was subtle. The shape of the jaw, the eyes. Something about him felt strangely familiar. "Mom," Lily asked quietly, "who was he?" Margaret's expression changed instantly. Not dramatically, just enough for Lily to notice. A shadow crossed her eyes. "Someone from a long time ago. You never talk about him." Margaret folded her hands together. "Some stories belong in the past." Lily almost pressed further. Almost. But years of experience told her when her mother did not want to continue a conversation. She let the matter drop. Later that afternoon, while organizing the contents of the box, a folded envelope slipped onto the floor. Lily picked it up. There was no stamp, no address, only a name written neatly across the front. Ethan. Her heart skipped. Slowly she looked toward the living room where Margaret sat reading. For several seconds, she simply stared at the handwriting. Then she placed the envelope back inside the box exactly where she had found it. Meanwhile, Daniel Brooks sat inside a private records office reviewing information that had taken surprisingly little time to locate. Employment history, address records, public documents. Nothing unusual at first. Then he noticed the mother's name. Margaret Harper. Daniel leaned back in his chair. The name sounded familiar. Very familiar. He opened another database and searched deeper. Seconds later, a photograph appeared on the screen. Daniel froze. 25 years earlier, Margaret Harper had appeared in dozens of newspaper society columns alongside one particular young businessman whose career was just beginning. Ethan Caldwell. Daniel stared at the two photographs side by side. The old image of Ethan and Margaret. The recent image of Lily Harper from an employment file. A cold feeling settled into his chest. Suddenly, Ethan's strange request no longer seemed strange at all. Daniel Brooks arrived at Ethan's office just before sunset. The city outside glowed with streaks of orange and gold as the last light reflected across the glass towers of downtown Chicago. Ethan looked up from his desk the moment Daniel entered. One look at his friend's face told him something significant had been discovered. "What is it?" Ethan asked. Daniel closed the door behind him and placed a thin folder on the desk. "You were right to pay attention to that necklace." Ethan felt his chest tighten. Daniel opened the folder and slid several photographs across the polished surface. The first image showed a younger version of Margaret Harper standing beside Ethan 25 years earlier. Both were smiling. Both looked happy. Ethan stared at the photograph for several seconds without speaking. Memories he had buried beneath decades of business deals and responsibilities suddenly returned with startling clarity. Summer weekends near Lake Geneva. Long conversations that stretched past midnight. Plans for a future that never happened. "Where did you get this?" Ethan finally asked. "Public archives. Old newspaper records." Daniel hesitated. "There is more." He placed another photograph beside the first. This one was recent. Lily Harper from an employment file. Ethan immediately saw it. The eyes. The shape of the face. Certain features he had somehow overlooked inside the restaurant. Not identical, but enough to make his pulse quicken. "That cannot be possible," Ethan said quietly. Daniel leaned forward. "Maybe not, but there are questions that deserve answers." Ethan stood and walked toward the window overlooking the city. For years he had convinced himself that Margaret simply chose another life, chose another future. After she vanished, he searched for months before finally accepting that she was gone. Yet now fragments of the past were resurfacing in ways he could not ignore. Meanwhile, across town, Lily sat beside her mother in the small apartment living room. Rain tapped softly against the windows. Margaret held a cup of tea between her hands while an old movie played quietly in the background. Neither of them paid much attention to it. Lily's thoughts remained fixed on the envelope she had discovered earlier. "Mom," she said carefully, "were you ever going to tell me about Ethan?" Margaret's hands froze. The room suddenly felt very still. "You saw the envelope." It was not a question. Lily nodded. "Who was he?" Margaret lowered her eyes. For a long moment she said nothing. Then she spoke so softly Lily almost missed the words. "He was someone I loved very much." Lily waited. "And?" Margaret looked toward the rain-covered window. "And sometimes life takes people in different directions." The answer felt incomplete. Lily could sense it, but she also recognized the sadness in her mother's voice. a sadness that had clearly existed for many years. Later that evening, after Margaret had gone to bed, Lily returned to the wooden box and carefully examined every photograph again. She was searching for something she could not quite explain. A clue, a connection, some missing piece. Then she noticed something she had never paid attention to before. In one faded photograph, hanging around Margaret's neck, was the exact same silver necklace Lily wore every day. And standing beside her mother was a young man whose face suddenly looked far less like a stranger. The following morning began with an uneasy silence. Ethan arrived at his office before sunrise, something he had not done in years. The city was still waking up. Streetlights glowed beneath the fading darkness while the first hints of daylight touched the horizon. Yet none of it held his attention. The folder Daniel had left sat open on his desk. Photographs, records, dates, questions. Too many questions. He picked up the photograph of Margaret again. 25 years had changed countless things, but the smile was unmistakable. He remembered the day that picture had been taken. He remembered believing they would spend their future together. Then one day she was simply gone. No explanation. No goodbye. No way to find her. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Daniel entered carrying another file. This one was thicker. I found more, he said quietly. Ethan looked up immediately. Daniel sat down and opened the folder. Hospital records. Public archives. Employment histories. Nothing conclusive yet, but there is a pattern. Ethan listened carefully. Go on. Daniel slid several pages across the desk. Margaret moved 3 times within 2 years after she disappeared. She never married. There is no father listed on Lily's early records. The room became very still. Ethan felt a strange pressure building inside his chest. And Daniel hesitated. And the timeline is difficult to ignore. Ethan stared at the documents. Numbers, dates, places. Individually, they meant little. Together, they painted a picture he was beginning to fear. Across the city, Lily sat inside a small neighborhood coffee shop completing another job application. The morning crowd moved around her while she focused on filling out forms. She had already submitted 7 applications since waking up. Bills did not wait for answers. Rent did not wait for explanations. As she reviewed another application, her phone buzzed. A message from the clinic regarding her mother's upcoming appointment. The estimated cost made her stomach sink. She closed her eyes briefly. Then she took a deep breath and continued typing. Giving up was never an option. Back at the apartment, Margaret stood alone in the kitchen staring at an old photograph she had removed from the wooden box. Her fingers trembled slightly. For years she had protected certain secrets because she believed it was the right thing to do. But secrets had a way of refusing to stay buried forever. She knew that now. Her eyes drifted toward the window. Somewhere beyond the endless streets and buildings of Chicago, a past she thought was finished seemed to be finding its way back. Late that afternoon, Daniel received a phone call from a retired records clerk who had worked at a hospital decades earlier. The conversation lasted less than 10 minutes. When it ended, Daniel remained seated at his desk, staring into space. Slowly, he reached for his phone and called Ethan. I think we need to talk, he said. Did you find something? Ethan asked immediately. Daniel exhaled. Not proof. Not yet. But I found a missing piece. Ethan stood from his chair. What piece? Daniel's voice lowered. The hospital where Lily was born kept archived emergency contact records. Most were destroyed years ago. One survived. Ethan's pulse quickened. And there was a long pause. The contact name listed on the original file was not Margaret Harper. Ethan gripped the edge of his desk. Then who was it? Daniel looked down at the document in front of him. Then he spoke the name that caused every certainty in Ethan's world to begin unraveling. Ethan Caldwell. For several seconds, Ethan could not speak. The city skyline beyond his office windows seemed to disappear as his attention locked onto the document Daniel had uncovered. His own name, listed as the emergency contact on records connected to Lily's birth. The paper trembled slightly in his hand. There has to be a mistake, he said quietly. Daniel shook his head. I thought the same thing. I checked twice. Ethan lowered himself into his chair. The memories came faster now. Margaret telling him she was leaving town for a few weeks. The unanswered calls. The letters returned unopened. The months he spent searching before finally accepting that she was gone. At the time, he believed she had chosen another life. He never imagined there might have been another reason. Why would she keep this from me? Ethan whispered. Daniel did not answer. Some questions could only be answered by Margaret herself. Across the city, Lily returned home carrying 2 grocery bags filled with carefully chosen necessities. She had stretched every dollar. Store-brand soup, bread, a carton of eggs. Nothing extra. As she unlocked the apartment door, she found her mother sitting quietly at the kitchen table. The wooden box rested beside her. Several photographs were spread across the surface. Margaret looked as though she had been staring at them for hours. "Mom?" Lily asked. Margaret slowly looked up. Her eyes were red. Not from tears. From memories. "Sit with me for a minute." Lily placed the groceries on the counter and joined her. The silence felt heavier than usual. Margaret picked up one photograph. The same lakeside picture Lily had studied so many times. "There are things I should have told you years ago," she said softly. Lily's heart immediately began to race. "About him?" Margaret nodded. Before either woman could continue, a knock sounded at the apartment door. Both looked up. Neither was expecting visitors. Lily walked to the entrance and opened it carefully. A courier stood outside holding a sealed envelope. Delivery for Miss Lily Harper. She signed for it and carried it back to the table. There was no return address, only her name written neatly across the front. Curious, she opened the envelope and unfolded the single sheet inside. Her eyes widened. It was an invitation. A request for a private meeting at Daniel Brooks' law offices the following afternoon. The letter was polite but vague. No explanation. No details. Just a request that she attend. "What is it?" Margaret asked. Lily handed her the paper. The moment Margaret saw the law firm's name, the color drained from her face. Lily noticed immediately. "You know something?" Margaret stared at the invitation. Her hands tightened around the paper. 25 years of carefully buried truths seemed to rise to the surface all at once. Meanwhile, Ethan remained alone in his office long after sunset. The city lights flickered below like distant stars. The evidence was no longer pointing toward a possibility. It was pointing toward a truth. A young woman had lost her job because of him. A young woman who might be his daughter. The realization settled heavily inside him. For the first time in decades, no business problem, no negotiation, and no amount of money could provide an easy solution. Tomorrow would bring answers. But deep down, Ethan feared those answers might change everything. The following afternoon arrived with steady rain falling across the city. Gray clouds covered the skyline, and the streets below shimmered beneath reflections of passing headlights. Lily sat quietly in the passenger seat of a rideshare vehicle, holding the invitation in her hands. Beside her, Margaret stared out the window. Neither woman had spoken much during the drive. Too many thoughts crowded the silence between them. When they arrived at Daniel Brooks' law offices, Lily felt her stomach tighten. The building was elegant but intimidating. Polished stone floors, tall glass walls, quiet hallways where every detail seemed expensive. A receptionist greeted them and guided them toward a private conference room. Inside, Daniel stood near the window. Ethan was already there. The moment Lily saw him, memories of the restaurant rushed back. The humiliation, the embarrassment, the job she had lost. Her expression hardened immediately. Ethan noticed. The reaction hurt more than he expected. "Thank you for coming," Daniel said carefully. Nobody sat down at first. The room felt charged with tension. Finally, Margaret stepped forward. "You found out," she said quietly. Ethan looked at her. 25 years disappeared in an instant. For a moment, he saw the young woman he had once planned an entire future around. "Why?" he asked softly. "Why did you leave?" Margaret closed her eyes. "Because I thought I was protecting everyone." Ethan stared at her. "Protecting who?" She looked toward Lily. Her. Silence filled the room. Lily looked. From one face to another. Someone needs to explain what is happening. Daniel placed a folder on the table. Inside were copies of records, photographs, and documents gathered over the previous days. "Miss Harper," he began carefully, "the evidence strongly suggests that Ethan Caldwell is your biological father." The words seemed to stop time itself. Lily did not speak. She simply stared at him. Then she laughed once. Not because it was funny, because it felt impossible. "No," she said. "That cannot be true." Margaret's eyes filled with sadness. "Lily, you knew?" Lily turned toward her mother. Margaret lowered her head. That answer alone was enough. The room became very quiet. Years of unanswered questions suddenly collided with a truth she never expected. Lily looked back at Ethan, the billionaire who had publicly humiliated her. The man responsible for her losing the job she desperately needed. The stranger who might also be her father. Ethan stepped forward slowly. "I did not know," he said. "I swear to you, I did not know." Lily's eyes flashed with emotion. "But you knew enough to judge me." Ethan had no response. Because she was right. The memory of that night now felt unbearable. Every word he had spoken echoed inside his head. Lily shook her head and stepped away from the table. "My entire life," she said quietly, "I wondered who my father was. And now I find out he was standing right in front of me, treating me like I was nothing." Ethan felt every word. There was no defense, no explanation, no amount of money that could undo what had happened. For the first time in his life, the most powerful man in the room had absolutely no power at all. Rain continued falling outside the office windows long after the conversation should have ended. Nobody seemed eager to leave. The truth had finally been spoken aloud, yet it had created even more questions than answers. Lily stood near the window with her arms folded tightly across her chest. She was not crying. Somehow that made the moment feel even heavier. Margaret remained seated at the conference table, staring down at her hands. Years of silence had brought them here. Years of choices she had convinced herself were necessary. Finally, she lifted her head. "You both deserve the truth." The room became still. Ethan slowly sat down. Lily remained standing, but turned toward her mother. Margaret took a deep breath. 25 years ago, when I found out I was pregnant, Ethan and I were already struggling." Ethan frowned. "Struggling? We were planning a future together." "You were building an empire," Margaret replied gently. Every week brought another business trip, another opportunity, another responsibility. Ethan opened his mouth to respond, then stopped. Part of him knew she was not entirely wrong. "I was scared," Margaret continued. "Not because of you. Because of what your world was becoming." Her voice trembled slightly. "One day, I overheard a conversation. Investors, advisors, people discussing your future. One of them said a family would only slow you down." Ethan stared at her. "I never said that." "I know that now," Margaret whispered. "But back then I believed I was protecting you from having to choose." Silence settled over the room again. Lily listened carefully. Every sentence felt like another missing puzzle piece falling into place. Margaret reached into her purse and removed a small bundle of old letters tied together with a faded ribbon. She placed them on the table. "These are all the letters you sent me." Ethan looked confused. "I never stopped writing." "I know." Margaret nodded. "I read every one of them." Ethan's eyes widened. "Then why did you never answer?" Margaret lowered her gaze. "Because every month that passed made it harder. Then Lily was born. Then another year passed. Then another. Eventually, I convinced myself it was too late." Lily looked at the letters, then at her mother. There was sadness in the story, regret, but there was no cruelty, no scheme. Just two people making imperfect decisions while trying to do what they believed was right. Ethan slowly reached for the bundle of letters. His hand shook slightly. "All these years," Margaret nodded. "All these years." Lily felt something inside her begin to shift. The anger had not disappeared. The pain certainly had not. But for the first time she could see the tragedy. Behind the truth. No villain. No mastermind. Just decades of missed chances. As thunder rolled softly in the distance, Ethan looked toward his daughter. Not a waitress. Not a stranger. His daughter. And for the first time since entering the room, Lily did not look away. 3 weeks later, the rain had finally given way to clear spring skies. Sunlight poured through the windows of a quiet lakeside restaurant just outside Chicago. The water shimmered beneath the afternoon sun, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of fresh grass and blooming trees. It was not one of Ethan's restaurants. That had been Lily's condition. If they were going to meet again, it would be somewhere neutral. Somewhere without reminders of the night, everything changed. Ethan arrived early. For perhaps the first time in his life, he felt nervous about a meeting. There were no contracts on the table. No negotiations. No business strategy. Just an empty chair across from him and the possibility of a second chance. When Lily entered, he stood immediately. She offered a small nod and took her seat. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was no longer hostile. It was simply careful, human, real. Finally, Ethan smiled faintly. "Thank you for coming." Lily looked out toward the lake. "I almost did not." Ethan nodded. "I would not have blamed you." Another silence followed. Then Lily surprised herself by asking the question she had been carrying for days. "What was I like as a child in your imagination?" Ethan looked down at the table. His expression softened. Every year on your birthday, even though I did not know where you were, I wondered what kind of person you were becoming. Lily blinked. Ethan continued quietly. I imagined soccer games, school plays, graduation ceremonies. I imagined being there. His voice caught slightly. I just never knew there was actually someone to miss. The honesty in those words reached her in a way money and apologies never could. Later that afternoon, Margaret joined them. For the first time in decades, the three of them sat together without secrets between them. They spoke about old memories, missed opportunities, regrets. They laughed once or twice. They cried a little too, not because the pain was gone, but because healing had finally begun. As the sun slowly lowered toward the horizon, Ethan reached into his jacket pocket and placed something on the table. It was the silver necklace box he had kept all those years. Inside rested an identical pendant to the one Lily wore around her neck. Lily stared at it, then at him. You kept it. Ethan smiled. I never stopped hoping I would need it someday. For the first time since meeting him again, Lily smiled back. It was small, fragile, but real. Months later, life looked different. Ethan helped with Margaret's medical care, not because he felt obligated, but because he wanted to. Lily found a new job at a restaurant where she was respected. Slowly, carefully, father and daughter began building something neither thought was possible. Trust. It did not happen overnight. Some wounds take time. Some years cannot be recovered. But not every story is about getting back what was lost. Sometimes it is about choosing what comes next. One evening, as they gathered for dinner in Ethan's home, 3 place settings waited around the table. Years earlier, one chair would have remained empty forever. Tonight, every chair was filled. And for the first time in 25 years, nobody was missing.